August 1943. A four-star general walks into a field hospital tent. Inside, wounded men lie bleeding from shrapnel wounds, missing limbs, faces wrapped in gauze. The general stops at one soldier, no visible injuries, just trembling hands and hollow eyes. What happens next will nearly destroy the career of the most brilliant battlefield commander America has ever produced. His name is George S. Patton. And his mouth, sharp, vicious, and unstoppable, would become as dangerous to the Allied war effort as any German Panzer division. This is the story of how one man's genius was almost buried by his own words. The sun over North Africa in early 1943 revealed a commander who seemed born for war. General George S. Patton stood at the edge of the desert like a figure carved from iron, helmet polished, pistols gleaming, eyes fixed on the horizon where the Afrika Korps had once seemed unstoppable. Against Erwin Rommel, the most celebrated German field commander of the war, Patton brought speed, aggression, and relentless pressure. After the American disaster at Kasserine Pass, it was Patton who rebuilt morale, imposed discipline, and drove U.S. forces forward with a renewed sense of purpose. The battlefield responded to him. Units moved faster, orders were clearer, hesitation vanished. Patton was no accidental general. He was a West Point graduate of 1909, a student of military history who could quote ancient battles as easily as modern doctrine. He represented the United States in the pentathlon at the 1912 Stockholm Olympics, finishing fifth in the world, an embodiment of endurance and controlled violence. During the interwar years, when tanks were dismissed by many senior officers, Patton became one of America's earliest advocates of armored warfare, studying mechanized operations and pushing relentlessly for mobility, shock, and exploitation. When war finally came, it was as if his entire life had been rehearsal. In July 1943, commanding the U.S. 7th Army during the invasion of Sicily, Patton delivered results that were impossible to ignore. In just 38 days, his forces captured the island, racing across rugged terrain, seizing key ports, and taking more than 113,000 Axis prisoners. His army moved with a tempo that shocked both allies and enemies. The victory cemented Patton's reputation as America's most aggressive field commander, a general who understood momentum as a weapon. Yet beneath the brilliance lay a fatal flaw. Patton could read terrain like sheet music, but he could not read a room. His tongue moved as fast as his tanks and far less precisely. He publicly dismissed the Soviet Union soldiers as Mongols, voiced open contempt for British caution, and delivered speeches that glorified war not as a tragic necessity, but as a cleansing force. Even among allies, discomfort followed him like a shadow. His words traveled faster than his official reports, and they unsettled Washington as much as they energized frontline troops. Those close to him saw the warning signs. Patton's temper flared easily. He believed fear was a moral failure and weakness a personal sin. Compassion in his mind had no place on the battlefield. That belief would soon collide with reality. In August 1943, far from the roar of artillery, inside two hospital tents in Sicily, Patton's unchecked rage would explode. In moments unseen by cameras but recorded by history, his greatest weakness would surface and nearly end the career of the most dangerous general the Allies possessed. By August 1943, the Sicilian campaign was winding down, but the strain of weeks of combat lingered in places far from the front lines. Inside canvas hospital tents, the wounded lay quiet, the air heavy with antiseptic and exhaustion. It was here, not on a battlefield, that George S. Patton's control finally slipped. On August 3, 1943, Patton entered the 15th Evacuation Hospital near San Stefano. He was making a routine inspection, accompanied by medical officers and aides. On one cot sat Private Charles H. Cool of the 26th Infantry Regiment, diagnosed with what doctors described as battle fatigue, what the war would later call combat exhaustion. Cool had no visible wounds. When Patton stopped and asked what was wrong, the private explained that he could no longer take the strain of combat. Patton reacted instantly and violently. To him, there was only courage or cowardice and no medical middle ground. He accused Cool of lacking nerve, denounced him in front of staff and patients, and struck him across the face with his gloves. Witnesses recalled Patton shouting that such men had no place in the army and threatening severe punishment. Nurses stood frozen. Doctors, bound by rank and shock, hesitated before stepping in. The moment ended as abruptly as it began, but the damage was done. Word spread through the hospital tents within minutes. 7 days later, on August 10, Patton entered the 93rd Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia. This time, the tension followed him inside. On a cot lay Private Paul G. Bennett, another infantryman evacuated for combat exhaustion after prolonged exposure to shellfire. When Patton learned Bennett's diagnosis, the pattern repeated, only worse. He erupted, shouting insults, striking the private, and briefly drawing his ivory-handled Colt .45 pistol in a fit of rage. Medical staff later testified that Patton referred to Bennett as a coward and demanded he be sent back to the front immediately. The scene horrified those present. This was no battlefield discipline. This was uncontrolled fury. To understand Patton's actions is not to excuse them. In 1943, psychological trauma was poorly understood and deeply stigmatized. Many senior officers still believed that mental collapse under fire was weakness, not injury. Patton was a product and an extremist of that belief. He saw fear as contagious and compassion as dangerous. To him, allowing one man to break risked the collapse of many. But the Army Medical Corps knew better. Doctors filed formal reports after both incidents. Nurses spoke quietly but firmly among themselves. And beyond Sicily, journalists listened. The influential columnist Drew Pearson learned of the confrontations and began asking questions. The story moved up the chain of command with alarming speed. When the reports reached General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in the Mediterranean, he understood the stakes immediately. The Allies could not afford a public scandal, and they could not afford to lose Patton. What had happened inside those hospital tents was no longer a private failing. It was a ticking bomb, one that threatened to detonate at the highest levels of the Allied war effort. The reports reached General Dwight D. Eisenhower quietly, folded into official dispatches marked by clinical language and restrained outrage. Eisenhower read them alone. He had commanded men in war long enough to recognize both the severity of Patton's actions and the scale of what was at risk. This was not a simple disciplinary matter. It was a collision between military necessity and moral responsibility, unfolding at the worst possible moment of the war. By late summer 1943, Patton was more than a successful general. He was a weapon. German intelligence tracked his movements obsessively. Intercepted communications and post-war records would confirm that Erwin Rommel regarded Patton as the most dangerous American commander in the field. To the enemy, Patton's presence signaled attack. To the Allies, he represented momentum, aggression, and the ability to break stalemates. And ahead loomed the greatest operation of the war, the invasion of Western Europe. Eisenhower knew that removing Patton outright might satisfy public conscience, but it could weaken the Allied war effort at its most critical hour. Eisenhower chose a compromise that satisfied no one completely. Patton would not be court-martialed, nor publicly dismissed. Instead, he would be punished privately and humiliated thoroughly. Eisenhower ordered Patton to apologize in person to both soldiers he had assaulted, to the medical staff who witnessed his behavior, and to the combat units under his command. It was an extraordinary directive, one almost unheard of for a general of Patton's stature. Patton complied. In late August and early September 1943, he stood before hospital wards, then before entire formations, nearly 40,000 men of the 7th Army. The man who once thundered about glory and destiny now struggled to find words. Witnesses later described his voice breaking, his face flushed, his eyes wet. He admitted he had been wrong. He He told them simply, "I am sorry." Some soldiers applauded out of loyalty or respect. Others said nothing at all. The silence cut deeper than any reprimand. For Eisenhower, the matter was supposed to end there. But war, like truth, rarely stays contained. In November 1943, journalist Drew Pearson broke the story on national radio. He described the hospital incidents in vivid detail, naming Patton and condemning his actions. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Newspapers across the United States ran editorials calling Patton a disgrace to the uniform. Senators demanded investigations. Some called for his removal from command. Others went further, arguing he should never lead American soldiers again. The War Department was flooded with letters, thousands of them. Some came from grieving families, outraged that a general would strike exhausted soldiers. Others came from veterans and civilians who defended Patton as a necessary brutal instrument in a brutal war. The nation was split, and so was the Army. As the controversy raged, Patton was quietly sidelined. His future hung in the balance, even as Allied planners prepared for the decisive battles still to come. The war could not wait, but neither could the consequences of what had happened in those hospital tents. By the end of 1943, George S. Patton was no longer at the center of American battlefield command. Officially, he had not been relieved for incompetence or failure. Unofficially, everyone understood the truth. His outbursts in Sicily had made him politically radioactive. Eisenhower could not risk him in front of cameras, nor could he place him in a position where another misstep might fracture Allied unity. Patton was sent to England, stripped of an active combat role, and left to watch the war move forward without him. For a man who lived for action, the exile was agonizing. In letters and diary entries, Patton wrote of bitterness, frustration, and shame. He trained units, inspected bases, and waited. The invasion of Western Europe was coming, and the most aggressive American general in uniform had no army to lead. To many observers, his career appeared effectively over. Yet even in disgrace, Patton remained dangerous to the enemy. Allied planners preparing for Operation Overlord understood something the public did not. German intelligence believed in Patton with near-superstitious certainty. To them, he embodied American offensive doctrine. Wherever Patton went, an invasion would surely follow. Eisenhower and his deception planners decided to turn that belief into a weapon. Operation Fortitude was designed to mislead the German High Command about the location and timing of the Allied invasion of France. At its center stood a fictional force, the 1st U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. On paper, it was the largest Allied formation in Britain. In reality, it barely existed. Inflatable tanks filled empty fields. Wooden aircraft lined fake airstrips. Radio operators generated endless streams of false traffic. And presiding over it all was George S. Patton, publicly named as its commander. Patton played his role with discipline and precision. He toured southeastern England, made highly visible appearances, and allowed his movements to be carefully observed. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed the dummy camps. Abwehr analysts intercepted the staged communications. To them, the evidence was overwhelming. The invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest route across the Channel, and Patton would lead it. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed ashore in Normandy. Even as the beaches ran red, German commanders hesitated. Entire divisions remained pinned near Calais, waiting for Patton's phantom army to strike. For crucial weeks, the Germans held back their strongest reserves, convinced the Normandy landings were only a diversion. Patton, sidelined and silent, had helped win the most important deception of the war. In July 1944, the exile ended. With the Normandy front finally breaking open, Eisenhower brought Patton back into real command. He was given the U.S. Third Army, newly activated and ready to move. When the order came, Patton did not hesitate. He had been absent from battle, but not from purpose. The disgraced general returned to war not chastened, but sharpened. about to unleash one of the most relentless offensives in American military history. By the late summer of 1944, George S. Patton was once again doing what he did best, fighting and winning at a speed few commanders in history could match. After the breakout from Normandy, his Third Army surged across France in a relentless advance that stunned both allies and enemies. In just over 9 months of continuous operations, Patton's forces liberated roughly 81,000 square miles of occupied territory, captured hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, and destroyed entire enemy formations. His use of armored exploitation, decentralized command, and rapid logistics, most famously the Red Ball Express, would be studied in military academies long after the war ended. On the battlefield, Patton was vindicated. Off the battlefield, nothing had changed. As Allied armies pushed into Germany in early 1945, Patton's public remarks began to draw attention again, this time in a war already won. In April 1945, speaking to reporters, Patton compared the Nazi Party to the political parties of the United States, describing it as no different from a Democratic or Republican contest for power. The comment ignited immediate outrage. At a moment when concentration camps were being liberated and the scale of Nazi crimes was becoming undeniable, Patton's words sounded not merely careless, but morally blind. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Patton was appointed military governor of Bavaria. The role demanded political sensitivity and administrative discipline, qualities Patton had never possessed. Charged with enforcing denazification, he instead clashed openly with the policy. He argued that removing all former Nazi Party members from civil administration would paralyze the region. Many of those men, he insisted, were technicians and bureaucrats who had joined the party out of necessity, not ideology. Patton reinstated several officials, prioritizing order and efficiency over political cleansing. In Washington and at Supreme Headquarters, patience wore thin. Eisenhower, now overseeing occupation policy, understood the political minefield. The war had ended, but the peace was fragile. Patton, once indispensable, was now a liability. Still, Eisenhower hesitated until Patton spoke again. In September 1945, at a press conference, Patton repeated his earlier comparisons, once more equating Nazi Party membership with American political affiliation. The reaction was swift and unforgiving. There would be no more compromises. Eisenhower removed Patton from his command and reassigned him to the largely ceremonial post of commander of the 15th Army, tasked with writing a history of the war. The demotion was final. On December 9, 1945, near Mannheim, Germany, Patton was riding in a staff car when it collided with a U.S. Army truck. The accident seemed minor, but Patton suffered a severe neck injury. Paralyzed from the neck down, he lingered in a military hospital for nearly 2 weeks. On December 21, 1945, George S. Patton died, 12 days after the crash, 6 months after victory in Europe. He never returned home. In the end, Patton was not defeated by Rommel, nor stopped by Hitler's armies. His legacy was sealed by the same force that had nearly destroyed him before, a mouth that fired faster than any tank he ever commanded. George S. Patton's wartime record is as staggering as it is unsettling. Over the course of the Second World War, he commanded more than 400,000 American soldiers in combat. His armies liberated roughly 12,000 cities and towns across Europe, shattered German defensive lines, and captured an estimated 1.4 million enemy soldiers. Under his command, the U.S. Third Army became a force defined by speed, aggression, and relentless pressure. Few generals in history moved so far, so fast, or struck with such sustained intensity. That success came at a cost. Patton's forces suffered approximately 137,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. The price was severe, but the results were decisive. Third Army operations inflicted more than 1 million casualties on German forces, destroying entire divisions and collapsing fronts that had resisted other Allied armies for weeks. His winter counterattack during the Battle of the Bulge, turning his army 90 degrees in freezing conditions to relieve Bastogne, remains one of the most audacious operational maneuvers in modern warfare. Patton understood momentum not as an advantage, but as a necessity. His tactical legacy endures. Rapid armored thrusts, deep flanking maneuvers, and relentless pursuit of a retreating enemy were not new concepts, but Patton applied them with a scale and discipline that transformed theory into doctrine. He trusted subordinate commanders, pushed logistics to their limits, and believed hesitation was deadlier than risk. These principles are still studied at West Point and military academies around the world, not as historical curiosities, but as foundations of modern maneuver warfare. Yet Patton's legacy cannot be separated from his failures. The slapping incidents in Sicily exposed more than a moment of lost temper. They revealed a worldview incapable of recognizing psychological trauma as injury. Patton equated endurance with virtue and collapse with moral failure. In doing so, he misjudged men who had endured weeks of shellfire, sleep deprivation, and constant fear. His inability to adapt his understanding of courage marked the limits of his brilliance. The paradox of Patton lies in that contradiction. The war demanded commanders willing to be ruthless, decisive, and unyielding. Against an enemy that fought with fanaticism and brutality, caution often meant defeat. Men like Patton drove the Allied advance forward when hesitation might have prolonged the war and cost tens of thousands more lives. His aggression shortened campaigns and saved lives through speed. But war also exposed the danger of unrestrained genius. Patton's inability to temper his words, to recognize political and human realities beyond the battlefield, nearly destroyed his career and overshadowed his achievements. His mouth became his most unreliable weapon. George S. Patton saved thousands of lives through his tactics and leadership, and nearly lost everything through his inability to change. The war, desperate and unforgiving, found a way to use him anyway. History has been less merciful, remembering not only the victories he won, but the flaws he never overcame.